we get assignments. It's so fast, but you don't pay attention to eat because she don't smell me like water. You don't get anything. If woman get love, you just woman get money, while I show money. You should not get to him out the side. They gotta push him on the side. And eventually, they go suffer.
Never get finished. I never get finished. I never get finished.
Woman don't suffer, let everybody suffer. Money don't like woman don't like woman. She will be like water. You don't get anything. If woman not show money, if woman not pay money, you should not get to him out the side. They gotta push him on the side. And eventually, then go suffer.
Never get finished. I never get finished. I never get finished. Never get finished. I never get finished. I never get finished.
Shall we get assignments? It's so fast, but you don't pay attention to eating because she don't smell me like water. You don't get anything. If woman get love, you just woman get money, while I show money. You should not get to him out the side. They gotta push him on the side. And eventually, they go suffer.
Never get finished. I never get finished. I never get finished. Never get finished. I never get finished. I never get finished.
Good evening. It is 5 minutes past 5 on your Women Radio, WFM 91.7, and you're welcome on The Woman Agenda. The Woman Agenda this evening, we're going to be looking at the incoming administration and the appointment of women. Following the declaration of Bola Ahmed Tinubu as president-elect in the February 25 presidential election by INEC, different groups have started lobbying for appointments in the incoming administration. Now, the last elections for women produced only 3 female senators ahead of the 10th Senate. And now, looking at this, you will tell that this is a fall in the number of women we had in the last National Assembly. That is the 9th Assembly that we currently have before the 10th one. We had 8 women. But now, in the 10th Assembly, we're going to be having just 3 women. However, for the House of Representatives, the number of women slightly increased from 13 to 15, making a total of 18 women we're going to be having in the 10th Senate. Now, looking at this, we have different policies actually that speaks to women political participation, but we still struggle with implementation. The National Gender Policy recommends 35% affirmative action for women, but this hasn't been achieved in the Nigerian political space. just last year, 2022, the Nigerian Women Trust Fund, alongside other organizations, filed a lawsuit to seek interpretation of this law. And the women won. A federal high court in Abuja actually ordered the federal government to comply with the 35% affirmative action for women. And this would allow women to occupy 35% of all appointments. And in line with this, the president-elect Bola Ahmed Tinubu, when he campaigned, noted his intention to increase women's participation in government to at least 35% if elected. What do we hope to see from the incoming administration for women? What do we get to see? What are we expecting to see from the incoming administration? My name is Esther Alaribi, and you're welcome on the first episode of the Twitter series, The Woman Agenda. Today, as we get to discuss incoming administration and appointment of women, I have my guests. We're going to be having this conversation together. I'm speaking to Buki Shonibara, Executive Director of Invictus Africa. Buki is going to be joining us this evening. I also have Adora Onyichiri Sydney Jack, Executive Director, Gender Strategy Advancement International. Also, we're going to be having Awal Ibrahim Musa, Executive Director, Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Center. My guests today, we're going to be looking at this together, incoming administration and the appointment of women. Hello, good evening, Buki. How are you doing today?
Good evening, Esther. I'm doing well.
Thank you so much for joining us. Hello, Buki. Can you hear me? All right. Yes, we have Buki joining us, and that's Buki Shonibare, Executive Director of Invictus Africa. And we also have joining us, we have Adora Onyichiri Sydney Jack. Good evening, Adora, if you can hear me. All right, Adora will be joining us in a bit. I think she's trying to connect. She'll be joining us in a bit. So, yes, going on, Buki. Buki, in your own opinion, I know your organization, Invictus Africa, you've been collating data on how the women voted, participation of women in the last election. So in your opinion, how did women fare in the just concluded elections?
Well, just like you rightly an encouraging number as it relates to women representation. And when we look at women representation, we are looking at women representation from the context of elections, elective positions, as well as context of appointed positions. So in terms of elective positions, we usually look at 7 key positions. President, Vice President, Governor, Deputy Governor, Senate, House of Reps, and State Houses of Assembly. The reality, like we all know, is we've never had a female president in Nigeria will contest to be president in Nigeria. We have deputy president and vice president in Nigeria, even though we keep having more women actually contest for it. In the 2023 elections, what we had was that as against what we had in 2019, where out of 73 total candidates, we had at least 6 women who were presidential candidates. For these 2023 elections, out of the 18 presidential candidates, we only had 1 woman. That's the woman from the APM political party. Numbers keep going down for vice president. In comparison to what we had in 2019. In 2019, we had 73 total candidates. 22 of them were actually women. But for 2023, had candidates. This will be the first time since 2007 that we will not have a woman as a vice presidential candidate. So that tells you that right from even the presidential candidacy, that determines what we will see by the time we get to the point of who wins or who does not win. For the governorship election, total candidates were 420, 26 of them were women. For the deputy governorship, 420, of course, and then 100 of them were women. So far, we've only been able to gather data in terms of just 4 of those 100 that have been elected as a deputy governor. For Senate, we had 1,101 total candidates. 92 of them were women. And like you rightly identified, we've only had 3 of them that have been elected. That says that we have just 2.8% of the entire 109 vacant positions in the Senate that will be occupied by women. We can talk about the trend, what it looks like prior to now. But one thing you should know is that this is the lowest that we have had for time. So what that looks like is that the last time we had a 2.8 was in 1999. So basically, we went back to 1999. We've had better numbers. In 2007, we had, well, for what you can say, the best, where we had 8.3% of the total 109 as women. But now we are back to 2.8%. This is the second time we'll be having 2.8%. We've never had any 2.8 something. And this is in an era where we are talking about having at least 35%. Women. We are talking about 2.8%. So when you then go down to House of Representatives, 3,122 total candidates, 88 of them were women. But so far, I heard you say 18 the other time. The last time we updated our data was 15. I know that supplementary elections were conducted. There are still more supplementary elections to be conducted in 5 of the federal constituencies, and we're waiting for those outcomes before we can have a final figure. But at 15, at 15, it means we have just 4.2%. And then when you go to state houses of assembly, so far our data shows that we have 48 women that have been elected out of the 1,049 women who contested to be members of the state houses of assembly. Only 48 have been elected so far. Supplementary elections will still be held in 58 federal constituencies, some of which have female candidates. Why I've reeled out this data is to say that data shows that there is a problem in the way we have been trying to address the problem, and a problem perhaps in the way we have framed the problem so far. And because of the way we have framed the problem so far, there seems to be a problem in the kind of solutions that we are getting. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Buki, for all of this and giving us the data. So, in your own opinion, and to think that in the last how many years, there's been so much advocacy, so many conversations around getting more women in the political space. So, what would you tie this to, looking at the numbers that women were able to achieve in the last elections?
I think there's a fundamental problem in terms of women being able to advance politically. If we keep trying to push women into political spheres or leadership positions where the environment itself does not believe that women can actually advance, even the most educated among us, there are times where, of course, and it's in all spheres, whether business, politics, or any other place. One of the data that we're currently validating, we finished collecting, is the trend of how women have been appointed even into other non-political positions. And you see that trend as well in terms of, the preference for men. That is coming from a societal ideology or a societal value that believes that men will naturally, almost instinctively perform better when compared to women. The natural inclination seems to go to men, and then women are usually then considered when, let them not say we did not appoint women, and all of that. So I think that there is a fundamental societal problem, because we cannot expect to produce something that is contrary to who we really are. If who we really are as a people, it's from these people that leaders come in, and it is these leaders that appoint, it is these leaders that influence elections, it is these leaders that determine who will advance or who will not advance, it is these leaders that become godfathers and godmothers, whose sons should be elected. It is these leaders that are members of the society who bear these ideologies and who carry these ideologies even into the influential positions that they find themselves. I really is in the kind of society that we have, where it is believed that women should not advance, into leadership positions.
All right. Thank you so much, Buki. In case you're just joining us, this is the Woman Agenda, the Twitter series, and we're talking about the incoming administration and the appointment of women. Today, we're speaking to Buki Shonibara, Executive Director, Invictus Africa, and Adora Onyechere Sydney Jack, Executive Director, Gender Strategy Advancement International. And we're also going to be having Awal Ibrahim Musa, Executive Director, Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Center. And this conversation is necessary because, already different groups are already beginning to lobby for the appointment of different people into offices. And we're having this conversation because we've seen in this election that this election did not favor women, despite advocacy and different capacity building and all of that different organizations have had to do. But yet the numbers are really, really declining, and there's need for us to make a difference in this climb. All right, you can send us your comments, send us your contributions, 070-317-56537, 070-317-56537 to be a part of the conversation. We'll try to get Adora and Awal Musa to join the conversation in a bit. Seems there's some kind of technical challenge somewhere, but we'll try to rectify that. All right, Buki, like you referred to what we had in the past and the women. So, looking at the campaign promises of the president-elect of having to ensure 35% of women in this administration if elected, and now he's been elected, what do you hope to see differently?
Invictus Africa is to track, specific campaign promises, both at federal level and at international. And I will answer your question, but just to quickly make the point that a lot of times we focus on the federal, but these challenges where the shift really needs to take place, more often than not, is the state level, the subnational level, whether states, whether local government, even way below local government areas. So what we started doing is to then track or assemble those campaign promises, both the ones in their manifestos and the ones that were said, in the course of engagement with different groups. And just like you rightly said, yes, the president-elect made promises. His promises, according to his renewed Hope manifesto, when it comes to women, is actually around social inclusion and political empowerment, around economic empowerment, around fighting domestic violence and abuse, and around educational parity. And one of the things under the social inclusion and political empowerment is the aspect of making sure that women form at least 35% of all government positions. Now, let me expand a bit based on how the president-elect framed that promise. Because once we are able to understand the promise, it helps us know exactly the expectation. So first, the president-elect promised that he's going to work with the National Assembly. So here, executive and legislative are working together to promote female employment in all government offices, ministries, and agencies. That is women's representation. The second says that it's going to increase women's participation in government to at least 35% of all government positions. The key word there is all government positions. So that means we are not just expecting that we should have anywhere there is opportunity for appointment of women. We should have nothing less than 35%. And let's not focus just on cabinet in terms of ministers. Let's also look at all other positions where the president actually has the power to appoint. So which is one of the things that we started doing at Invictus to release the data, what it is currently in terms of 2019 to 2023, expect that the president has the power to appoint. The third is that through legislation, mandates, particularly the cabinet and core senior advisors to reserve, and permit me to say a bit on that,
Okay.
to reserve a minimum number of senior positions for women, and that is going to strongly encourage private institutions to do likewise. So it recognizes the fact that it does not have oversight or responsibility over private institutions, but is going to encourage them. It's going to encourage them, and what we expect to see is that encourage them by showing example in your own appointment, and also encourage them as the president of the country under which we have these institutions. But Esther, my last point on this will say, remember last year on March 1,
Yeah.
that is the gender bill that relates to reserving seats for women. That generated a lot of controversies around, should we even reserve seats? Every country where we have seen increased women participation, South Africa, Rwanda, Namibia, I always use the example of Namibia. Their SWAPO political party, where they use this 50-50, what they call the zebra policy. They didn't just do that. Countries like South Africa constitutionalized women representation. To say that not just see it as a campaign promise or even live up to it. When you constitutionalize it, you seal it up.
Hello, Buki. Hello, Buki. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you clearly now. Go ahead, please.
Yes. So I like the fact that the president-elect in his campaign promise said that he is going to mandate the federal executive to reserve a minimum number of senior positions. It's not specific in terms of the minimum number, but if we're going to have that reservation of seats, it means that should be the standard, that should be the basis. And the fact that he said 35%, it means that, and he said in all government positions. So that means in all of the government positions where there's going to be some form of appointment or the other, our benchmark should be 35%. So if we currently have a 44-man cabinet under the President Buhari administration, let's say no ministry is lumped into another, or let's even use the 44. It means that if we use 44 like we currently have, that means that if the president is going to appoint, we expect nothing less than 15 to 16 women. Nothing less than that. There are more advanced societies where they're even pushing for 50-50. And the logic is, if we have 50%, about 50% population of women, why are we even pushing for 35%? But what we are saying is, let 35% be the starting point. So if the president-elect wants to go with the current number of positions that we have in the cabinet, which is 44, if he goes with that, the minimum we should be expecting in terms of the number of women he should appoint should be at least 15 to 16. I yield the floor.
15 to 16. Okay, Buki, so I hear you. So in that case, there's been some kind of conversations in the past where you get to hear things like, we don't see these women come forth. We don't see women who can fit into these positions. What would you say to that?
We don't see women come forth is one narrative. We don't see women who can fit into this position is another narrative. So the old, we don't see women come forth. I mean, Esther, I read out the number of women who contested in each of the key elective positions. Can we indeed say that women are not coming forth? If based on the election of a particular circle, if just 1% out of the total number of women that came out have been elected, do you think that it will encourage more women to come out another time? Which is why I said that it dates society. Are women coming out? Yes. You fuel that narrative that women are not coming out. Despite the impediment to women being able to come out, women are still coming out. Look at the battles that we're having in Adamawa State. I'm hoping that the supplementary election that will be conducted in April 14, I'm hoping that it goes. And we're not saying that elect women because they are women. we're saying that don't look at women from the lens of just the fact that this person is a woman. Look beyond that and look at the fact that this person is equally human like the other man and is as equally qualified like the man, not from the gender lens. So are women coming out? Yes. Then the narrative of women fit is part of the socio-cultural narratives that I said impede women's participation or women's representation, I beg to say, women's representation in political sphere, where we believe that women actually are not fit. And guess why that narrative is so? Because they are women. So long as it is a woman, we attach a label of weakness. We attach a label of subservience. We attach a label of she cannot do it. We attach that label so long as the person is a woman. Until we remove that kind of label or our ability to be able to label women that way, we will not have a society that will naturally vote for a woman on the basis of the fact that they know that these women can do it. I yield.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Buki. In case you're just joining us, this is the Woman Agenda, and yes, we're having this conversation talking about the need to appoint women in the incoming administration. And yes, we've had to look at it from different angles. And Buki Shonibari, Executive Director Invictus Africa, has given us her own point of what she thinks and breaking the narrative of there are no women who fit into these positions. Yes, we're still expecting our other speakers. We're expecting Adora Onyechiri Sydney Jack, Executive Director, Gender Strategy Advancement International, and Awal Ibrahim Musa, Executive Director, Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Center. You can send us your comments, your contributions, 070-317-56537. And yes, if you're live on the Twitter space, you can leave us comments on the comment section on Twitter. So we'll be sure to take all of your comments. All right. So, Buki, still going back to you. Now, there have been different interventions on trying to seal the gap in the political space. Let's talk about the 111 seats proposed by Honorable Nkiruka Onyejiocha and co-sponsored by Honorable Femi Gbajabiamila, and this one did not see the light. What do you think about this?
So again, I think that, and for those, just for context, for those listening to us, what Esther has just talked about is the problem that we had when on March 1 last year, 5 gender bills were actually thrown out by both Senate and the House of Reps. These 5 gender bills were bills that was part of the 68 constitutional amendment bills that was proposed to both houses. And in those bills, we had 5 that related to women, which is why we have tagged it the 5 gender bills. Gender bills relating to reserve seats, which I will then come to in terms of answering your question. And for context, the reserve seat is actually supposed to amend some part of the Constitution, specifically 48, 49, and 91 of the Constitution, to make sure that we are able to create additional 37 seats at the Senate, additional 74 seats at the House of Reps, and additional 108 seats at in the entire state houses of assembly, so that we can increase women representation. And that came about because we realized that if we continue to have the elective, the electioneering process go the way it is, we will always continue having less than 10% of women. So we believe that just to be able to bridge that gap, and having a reserve seat is actually a UN recommended approach. First, it is a temporary special measure where once you have dealt with the problem that you're trying to address, such as introducing a reserve seat, then you can remove that particular policy. Usually for the bill that was proposed by Honorable Nkiruka is to say that after 16 years, then we expect that there should have been some form of balance, and then you can remove this. Because if we don't remove it, we'll get to a point where the gender inequality will then be in favor of women, but not so much of men. So it's to say that the reserve seat bill is a temporary special measure. It is recommended by the international community to bridge gaps around unequal representations, and it's not just for women. It could be persons with disability. It could be young people. So it's not reserve seat is not just for women. And so I laid that context before I answered this question to say that part of the argument against the reserve seat during that period was to say that the reserve seat is actually tokenistic. Why are we reserving seat for women? Are we simply saying that they are not qualified? But we forget that there are many countries who use reserve seats, to bridge the gap. Burundi reserves 30%. Djibouti reserves 25%. South Sudan reserves 25%. Tanzania reserves 30%. Kenya and Zimbabwe reserve 47% of their 350 and 60% of their 270 parliamentarian seats. You have countries like Uganda, like South Africa, even the Rwanda that we celebrate today. There are countries in sub-Saharan Africa and across Africa and beyond Africa that use reserve seats to bridge the gap that affect historically marginalized people, in this case women not being represented. So I think that the way it was framed, or the way people interpreted it, that you're just giving token to women who we know are not qualified. No. It was also argued that the reserved seat bill is actually quite expensive. Expensive on the basis of the fact that, so that means we are going to have more senators that we're paying and all of that. But we forget, and I like the work that Plaque did on this. Plaque did an analysis to say, should this reserve seat, should it actually go through? This is what it will cost the National Assembly extra. Guess what? It wasn't up to 10% of what the National Assembly is currently spending. Why don't we reduce the cost of governance at the National Assembly position and increase so that we can have more women and still be able to spend what we are currently using or even less? And even if we don't want to reduce the number of members of the National Assembly and we decide to just go with what we currently have, are we saying that 10% increase in the cost is too much for us to have equity, for us to have equality? So that's my own take, and I did a write-up on that, dissecting the reserve seat bill, dissecting Nigeria's reserve seat bill, where I laid out all of this point, and I think it was published on some online stuff, including cable, so you can go and read it there. That's my thought on the reserve seat.
All right, thank you so much, Buki. All right, we have joining us now, we have Adora Onyechere Sydney Jack, Executive Director, Gender Strategy Advancement International. Good evening, Adora. How are you doing today?
Good evening.
Yes, how are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you.
All right, thank you so much for joining us this evening in the conversation.
Thank you.
All right. So from your own point of view, how did women do in this last election?
Come again, how are the what?
Yes, how women participated as voters and as candidates. How would you say women performed this time around?
I think that, there was a lot of enthusiasm. I mean, if you listen to what Buki said critically, the statistics show for itself. There was a lot of enthusiasm when the continuous voters registration exercise started and began. More women got into the spaces. We had an increased number of women, voters to about 49.5%, increase to match that of the statistics of the men. And, it's one thing for participation, is one thing for, getting involved. The question is really, did the women who registered really come out to vote, looking at the turnout of the elections, and how many of that statistics voted for women, and how many of our women were even this election. So the numbers speak for itself. But I would say that, prior to the elections, in terms of the build-up, in terms of getting into the proper election, the statistics were already, discouraged by the kind of policy implementations we've had, since this administration. And I would say categorically, I mean, the 5 gender bills that were stepped down by this ninth assembly, this ninth parliament, one would really ask, what was the reason behind, stepping those bills down? I mean, I've heard the argument on not enough lobbying, not enough advocacy, but then it is just sheer common sense that we look at enabling environment for our women in Nigeria. It's just sheer common sense that, the parliament looks at the issue of inclusion as a dominant factor in our democracy and improving our economic well-being, especially as women are the burden bearers when it comes to insecurity, when it comes to the economy, and when it even comes to policy development. How many of those policies that are made really have women at the center, sitting on those policy-making table? So when a parliament steps down gender bills, ab initio, that is meant to empower its women, you begin to ask, really, how did they get there? What was the motive of representation? What is the gender understanding in terms of are they just there to represent themselves and the men? Are they not looking at the holistic adventure of looking at, participation in government, allude to both men and women? So these are some of the critical analysis I was able to review, because in the wake of Occupy NAS, when Nigerian women went in front of National Assembly for over 3 weeks to demand for these bills to be passed, to the point where we had first ladies sit in the chambers, try to implore on their conscience, and also plead, through their maternal instinct to be able to wade in on their sensitivity. That didn't work. So it just shows you the kind of toysism that that have perverted our system. Because again, we say we operate a patriarchal system, but then we are dominated by a women's population where burden bearers, the economy, are all chaperoned by women. So the question is really, what is it that we are not saying, or how are we saying it? And that's really usually the conversation people like to raise. But then you look at other countries. I mean, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Scandinavian countries were the forerunners in implementing policies that actually moved their countries forward and reduced the number of casualties in those countries. And they were led by women. I mean, you're talking about Netherlands, Sweden, you're talking about Geneva, you're talking about Iceland, you're talking about countries that were, led by women. And it didn't, I mean, there was no argument on capacity. There was no argument on culture. There was no argument on tradition. But you come back to Africa, Nigeria is a giant, and we keep signing treaties, going for conferences. Parliamentary Union will have all of the men from the National Assembly going for conferences across other African countries. And so many times I have asked them, where are your women? They have asked them this question. Sometimes when they go and you find out that there is an embarrassing silence, there is nothing to say back, because there is no political will to see these spaces evened out. And I think that's why, beyond just, our demands and our advocacy, there needs to be an emergency outcry. I see what the women in Kenya have done. I see what the women in Uganda are doing. Recently, even Kenya is calling for a constitutionalizing of their first lady office. They want a law in parliament that looks at that office as an office that is legitimate, whereby you are able to review outcomes, ask for demands, because taxpayers' monies are also going into the first lady's office, whether we like it or not. So why not just legal? Why don't you just make it legitimate? So that's the argument from Kenya. But we come back to Nigeria, and it's almost as if you begin to really wonder what really is the problem. Is it with the political party structuring? Is it with the women's literacy and policy and politics and what they actually understand politics to mean? Is it also a space that has been so overwhelmed by patriarchal system and by misogyny that even when we lobby, we have to lobby in a way that is beggarly rather than like a need? So I feel that we need to probably just have, like I said, there needs to be an emergency outcry. And even though we have waited in front of the National Assembly, I am looking forward to a 10th Assembly that will look at this as an emergency, as a priority. However, the question is, how are we going to mobilize that with less women in the parliament? How are we going to mobilize that with almost 4% women in the parliament less than what we had in 2019? So I believe that what we can do going forward in terms of women's participation is beyond the conversations that we're having in spaces like this, in conferences and our summits, in our sit-outs, in our dialogues. I also think that in as much as we do know that there are some groups of women and NGOs and coalitions that are looking at evening these spaces, it should be consistent. It should be sustained, and it should not stop till we get results, even when it looks like the hatchet is on our back. And I say this because when we did the Occupy National Assembly, when the bills were stepped down, and there was a call on review of the two, they said we should give them some time. They will call us back to the drawing table. We understand there were some moves to lobby. There were some interventions. But I can tell you that even the woman that sponsored that extra seat bill, Honorable Nkiru Konyajocha, is not coming back to the assembly. That's a woman that probably, if she had returned, would have had a chance at, probably asking or running for the seat of the speaker. So we have experienced women also exiting this ninth assembly because they did not make it back at the election. So the question is, who are the women who voted for other men? Who are the women who are voting women? We need to also rethink the strategy of our voting pattern. How are women voting? Why are they not voting more women? What should be the, advocacy for women to understand that it's important to fill up those spaces? I ran elections in 2019, and I can tell you that, when I decided to run, I left my job at least a year and 6 months and returned back home. Yet you could tell that there was a standpoint of women's believability to believe more in the men. Why? Because they felt that there were more finances in those spaces in terms of stomach infrastructure. And then number two, that a lot of their children who are male would lean on those men to become something. So they are also looking at post-election, what is the need for me? Even if I don't get money here, how are my children going to work? Who are they going to work with? How are they going to be accommodated? So these are the language of, the voters. And I know that somewhat it changed in this election because of lack of, accessible cash. However, it did not also change the voting pattern. We even had less turnout of women in this election. Again, we also know that there was violence in this election. To a large extent, where even in areas, for instance, in Imo State where I come from, my whole local government of Kigwe did not come out to vote because there were nobody inside due to insecurity. So the seven wards that were in that local government did not vote because people were busy trying to save their lives. So insecurity played a huge role. So how do we look at these dynamics? Because again, we need to look at the root causes and not the symptoms. It's great for us to look at statistics. It's great for us to look at data. But how do we maximize those numbers to begin to look at how we can have an emergent outcry, to look at an immediate solution, a short-term solution, and a long-term solution? The quota system seems great, but how is the interpretation? What is the literacy for that for women in the local level? What is their understanding of it at the community level, at the rural level? If you tell a woman extra seat bill, what does she think it is? How does it relate with her? So I think these are the kind of education that we must begin to shift from just having these conversations, at the state level, which I think is great, but moving them back down to the communities where the voter population is en masse.
All right. Thank you so much, Adora, for all of this analysis and having to give us real scenarios like where you mentioned in Imo State where they could not vote. Now, the question, are women actually voting for women? Like what you mentioned, some people will be concerned about what is in it for them. While the elections are over, we're talking about appointment of women in the incoming administration. Now we are speaking to Awal Ibrahim Musa, Executive Director, Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Center. Hello, Awal, are you here?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you clearly. Please go ahead.
Okay. Good evening.
Yes, good evening.
I've been waiting to speak, but that's great. Well, I think we need to first and foremost have a look at what happens even before the election.
Okay.
I think the exclusion or the marginalization of women began, right from the party primary, but because if the platform to contest election is only through political parties, and women are not, being in the position to participate in what happens at the political parties level because of the lack of democracy and lack of inclusion of women in the party decision making. That's where the first, challenge are. And I, concluded that, once the party primaries, ended, women, were going to suffer the kind of terrible ambush we have seen in the election in the 2023 general election, because 90% of the ambush had happened at the party primary, which we supposed to have ensured that that did not happen, but it has happened. So, for me, looking at the all the challenges that women face, looking at also the higher cost of election itself, because many women have not stolen money to be able to compete with those who have questionable money. They cannot compete with them in terms of spending, because these men, they have been stealing and they have been siphoning public taxpayers' money purposely to do what they are doing now. So that was also one of the challenges that decent women are having. Secondly, like I said, the nature of the political parties formation is one of the major challenges, and I think going forward, women must make sure that they actually participate in the elective position within the political parties, so that they can be at the leadership making level. Then, of course, the issue of indigeneity was one of the major challenges that many women have to face during the 2023 election. Again, when you look at the fact that the election is culmination of violence, thuggery, and attack of not only women but even disabled people and aged people. That is also another way in which women were completely aged out. So I think looking at all this, you can almost predict that women are going to suffer in 2023 general election. Now, going forward, whether the ruling party will help to do something is what we can now focus our attention to. I think for me, the incoming president, if he really wants the blessing of women and blessing of Nigerians and even international community, because we cannot be committing to different kind of international protocols or convention that seeks to promote women participation in politics and governance generally, and then you will now come and do a lopsided appointment. I think that will also ridicule the government, and the president, incoming president himself too, he will suffer such kind of action. So I want to say that the incoming president must ensure that women are given the necessary political position, but more importantly, to push for reform agenda, constitutional amendment that seek to ensure promotion of women participation in the socio-economic and political development in this country. The last assembly, the ongoing assembly, they have actually messed up. They did not, listen to Nigerians. Public hearings were conducted where a lot of people came, submitted memorandum, a lot of advocacy visits were done, but because the regime itself in totality, and both the executive at the executive level and at the legislature level, were more of not really welcoming women, increased political participation. They therefore did not bother to consider those important legal framework that can help address this marginalization and lack of inclusion of women into the leadership positions. So I think one of the tasks that I expect the President Tinubu to do is to reintroduce those bill, so that they will be considered, and we will have a more better legal framework of women inclusion in governance generally. So that is number one.
Okay.
Number two is to also reform the political party system in the country to allow for women participation and inclusion in the decision-making processes. If we are able to succeed in getting that happened, I think we would have been able to succeed in increasing more women representation and participation in the political and governance processes in the country. Again, I think the president elect he can do a lot in terms of ensuring that the legislature they also focus and do the kind of legislation that can help accelerate, if not improve, the women participation in politics. So this appointment, it should not be just at the federal level.
Okay.
It should be also at the state and local government level. And the president-elect Tinubu should work with all the ruling party governors to ensure that they encourage them and serve as the motivation for other political parties to equally do the same thing. And I want to conclude by saying that I think women should not be frustrated and should not be angry and should not really stop engaging. The reason why I say this is because if you get upset and angry, that is what some of these men and some even few women that are not interested in or they not understand the implication of what their position is, they will succeed in doing that. So I think women should continue to advocate, should continue to work in unity, should continue to focus and be able to ensure that those challenges are tackled. It's an ongoing issue. It's not something that can be resolved overnight. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Awal. Thank you so much for this. Yes, so I'm coming back to you, Buki, as we get to round off this conversation. As we're having this now, what would be your words to the president-elect in his appointment of women in the incoming administration?
It's just simple. I would say that the president-elect, when he's appointing, he should also appoint women. We expect that in his cabinet, we should see at least 35% of women represented in his cabinet positions. That would also encourage other states to follow suit. And most importantly, beyond him appointing women, is also for him to be able to work with the National Assembly as he promised in his manifesto, for us to enact laws that will ensure that women are represented. It means that laws such as the Reserve Seat Bill, there was another bill in the 5 Gender Bill that relates to ministerial commissioner nomination, which was to amend sections 147 and 192 of the Constitution, so that we can have at least 35% of women who are appointed. So I hope that not only should the president elect appoint women, but should make sure that he uses his good office to ensure that he works with the National Assembly to lay down laws that other successive presidents can actually leverage on for us to continue to have more women in our political sphere.
All right. Thank you so much, Buki. Yes, Adora, your final words and your words to the president-elect on the appointment of women in the incoming administration.
Okay. I would say that first, like Awal said, women should not get angry and frustrated, but I would rather put it differently. I would say they should channel that anger and frustration into increasing the momentum in our voices. And I mean that by saying we should have more women join political parties to begin to reform the political parties from the inside out, to begin to create, alignments and alliances with the men within the political parties inside out. Because when we have more women in the political parties, it is easier to galvanize and also push out the foot forward. And, I say this because at the UN Women's, CESW this year, I remember that the UN Country General did say that the track on gender parity is rescinding and it looks like it's vanishing. And he did say that on the track of the UN, women, they put it about 300 years away to actually, finally have gender equality. And so, like I was said again, it's a process, it's a work in the process. But how do we also maximize this? And I say this with my final words in my charge to the president-elect, is to please look at the revised national gender policy and implement. We have policies that are just sitting and are moribund. There have been a lot of work by organizations, coming together to look at it, Ministry of Women Affairs, RAPA, Women's Radio, etc. But we need to maximize our currency by using our voices to ask the president-elect to please review the national gender policy as it has been revised and review the implementation strategy and begin to activate it. It needs
Hello.
The voices of the women are in their number. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Adora. Thank you so much, Buki. And thank you, Awal, for being on the program this evening.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thank you, Awal.
Thank you.
Okay. So, yes, we've had it. We've heard from our different speakers. We've heard from Buki Shonibare, Executive Director, Invictus Africa. We've also heard from Awal Ibrahim Rafsanjani, Executive Director, Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Center. And we've also heard from Adora Onyechere Sydney Jack, Executive Director, Gender Strategy Advancement International. And they've told us about what they expect that the president-elect should be doing when he comes into office. And now, Nigerian women, just like our speakers have said, there is no need to deter, channel that energy into ensuring that you get more space for women in the political space. Women should have a place at the table, and women should also maintain the voice, regardless of how the elections have gone. Let's just be hopeful and see what comes out of the new administration for women and how women are going to be represented in the incoming administration. My name is Esther Laribe. Thanks to Amara Chuku for the support, and the executive producer Tonwoke Wale Shonaya. Do well to join us again on the next episode of The Woman Agenda, the Twitter Spirits, talking about the incoming administration and the need to appoint more women in the political space. My name is Esther Alaribe. Good evening.